what we will do now is just a quick reminder of some of the points that we want to discuss today. So, as we know, the discussions around race in the British context has very much historically, and also in Europe more broadly, been informed by a lot of US-centric vernacular language expressions. And we want to interrogate in today's session, does this work? So with this panel, what we're hoping to do is to explore the traveling power of US race discourse and its uses. We want to consider its limitations and effects in post-imperial Britain. Now, we aim to interrogate its current manifestations in British race formations, and we want to examine transatlantic conceptions of blackness in particular. And for that, we have 4 speakers, and the first speaker we will start off with for today is with Professor Robbie Shilliam. So Professor Shilliam is a professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University. He is most recently the author of Decolonizing Politics, which has been published with Polity, or will be published by Polity, I think, because it says 2021. So for now, I'm going to go quiet. I'm going to pass you over to Professor Shilliam. And Professor Shilliam, you have about 5 minutes for your thoughts, provocations, insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima, and call me Robbie. Yeah. So thank you, and thanks Mehdi and Louisa for organising this and inviting me. It's great to see everybody. It's good to see William in the audience. Yes, William, how are you? So I'm going to do something very kind of basic, but just to start the conversation off. And I think we could put it very generically and broadly and say something like this to start it off, right? That in the UK, you've always been able to talk about class, but less able to talk about race. And over the last while, that has been the big shift or challenge to talk about race whilst you're talking about class. In the US, you've been able to talk about race for a long time, but way less able to talk about class. But that in the last while, it's increasingly the case that to talk about race, people are starting to talk about class, right? And so that shift, in my mind, is a shift which is happening simultaneously, but it's a shift. But what is shifting is quite different, right? Even though that shift brings to bear the same kind of confrontation over explanatory frameworks and contention over politics and ethics. I think part of this shift is either being driven by or it's proceeding through a few other kind of phenomena, if we could call it like that. So one is in both places an increasing pluralization of Black communities. And in fact of what we would for want of a better word called non-white communities, and that's driven not just by migration but by that too, and it's becoming it's getting a greater traction than it might otherwise get because the pluralization of Black communities is especially pronounced in the spheres of culture and media. So that's one thing, and that leads to questions about the recomposition of Black communities and more broadly non-white communities and what that means. That is also linked to issues about social mobility or perceived social mobility, and the question about who is perceptively getting the gains of struggles which were fought in the past, right? So that's a kind of contention. Then there's another thing, which is the shifting dynamics of electoral politics, such that these questions and the way in which race and class articulates is very much over an increasing electoral distinction between cities and provinces. right? And you can see that in the US, and you can definitely see that in the UK. And that has a bearing because then it starts to become framed or reframed again in terms of multicultural, in quotes, connotations versus white nationalist heartlands, right? And then the third thing is that the responses to these shifting politics and the movements against these or in response to these shifting politics are heavily intergenerational in the way in which they're picked up and run forward. And the intergenerational distinctions are really important. That's also linked to shifts in political economy and shifts in the job market and debt and all that kind of stuff. But those shifts are also extremely gendered, which is really important. I mean, if there's one thing, say, with the Black Lives Matter stuff in the US, it's that young Black feminists refuse to sign on to the patronage of older Black men. So I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you so much for that, Robbie. Thank you. And I think your insights are going to be very important during the discussion because of your experience of being in London at Queen Mary and then moving over to the States. So I think that would be really interesting to look at how perhaps the UK race dynamics plays out, perhaps even in your lectures and your seminars, and how that's received by your American students. So our next speaker is Chardine Taylor-Stone, a writer, an activist, educator, and trade unionist. She is vice chair of the Musicians Union Equalities Committee and member of the London Regional Committee. In 2017, she won the British LGBT Award for contribution to LGBTQI life and is now currently writing her first book on the neoliberalization of Black feminism, as well as studying a master's in law. So without further ado, Chardine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh, right, I can unmute myself. Thank you very much. Thanks, Robbie. That's a really great and really interesting points that you made there. I think I'm going to focus more just on my experience of this kind of discourse and the sort of trade union work, and just kind of like day-to-day activist work that I do. So I'm a trustee for a domestic violence charity as well. So it's quite interesting to see how these kind of really interplay in like real life situations. So in the trade union world, it's actually one of the few kind of spaces where that kind of quite sort of individualist kind of American ideas around race haven't really taken a hold as much as people think they have. And I think that's mainly just because the practicalities of organizing. So if you're organizing a workplace around certain issues, pay or, you know, workers' rights, etc. I think the trade unions are trying to sort of bring in a more kind of thinking around, okay, well, let's look at how Black and Asian workers are disproportionately affected by short-term contracts, for example. But the organising is always still around everyone within that workplace, because then it won't work. You can't just have a strike of Black people or a strike of brown people in a workplace. It's not practical. So I think that's why there's still that class analysis still prevails there. But in terms of, there's a kind of a bit of a split. So you kind of have like the organisers who are still working on those lines. And then I guess you probably have the kind of administrators of the trade unions, the equalities officers, the kind of people that sit more in the office sort of thing. And that's where you start to see a bit more sort of engagement with that kind of sort of populist sort of BLM type politics. I won't say BLM because I know it's quite a sort of, there's lots of different sort of ideas about what it should be, but that the kind of sort of general kind of idea around Black only, I think is starting to see more influence in the kind of senior management level within the trade unions. So that's quite an interesting sort of dynamic to think about, that conflict between organising and those who kind of want to do the more kind of outward facing, what does the trade union movement look like and how does it recruit new and younger people? So that kind of conversation is going on at the moment. Just recently we had the TUC, which is Trade Union Congress for any Americans watching, made a really brilliant video about a young Black trans man sign up to their trade union, and getting their trade union to support them with like changing their name at work, etc. But I was at that, when that video came out, I was at the LGBT TUC conference, and I was the only Black person there, and I'm a cisgender woman. So, there's these two sort of things going on where the image is there, but actually the movement is still very white, still very straight, and really hasn't changed much since the 60s, actually, I would argue, really. So that's what's happening in the movement. I think, the sort of kind of wranglings that we've had with this kind of politics, I think we are starting, a bit like Robbie said, actually, we are starting to see a kind of a pushback against that. And I think the pandemic has really kind of played a role in that. I know particularly in the UK, there was this sort of urge to join your trade union, because obviously people were worried about furlough and worried about jobs getting cut and that sort of thing. And I think that sort of started to develop a kind of more of a kind of a class-based analysis amongst people that I often saw maybe 2-3 years ago, kind of peddling that kind of, extreme individualist type politics. And I feel like that politics is starting to become a bit dated in some ways. So like the way I see this kind of moving on social media, so people maybe 2-3 years ago would be like, oh, you're some sort of crazy Marxist socialist trade union, Chardine, you're out of touch, sort of your kumbaya stuff of working people with different races. And now those same people are now talking about Palestine, and you see them being quite active in trying to sort of talk about things which are happening to people that don't look like them. And I think that's really important. Just, was it last week or the week before, we had a huge protest in London in solidarity with Palestine, which I think must have been the biggest ever. 150,000 people were said to have attended. And I think that would not have been the size if it had not been for all the work that Black Lives Matter had done here already in getting people to understand about colonialism and imperialism. And so we're seeing like a kind of a sort of natural move to kind of a politics of solidarity, global solidarity. And that's quite exciting for me, because the last 5-10 years have been pretty horrendous in terms of, it's not just a kind of the arguing, it's actually a really sort of toxic and sort of almost like a purposeful sort of trying to breaking down of ties between communities and ties between activists that we've sort of built up over a really long period of time. So I think we are moving into a place where we're actually going to see a bit of a split between those who kind of are really sort of interested in doing a lot of the groundwork or writing about what's going on the grassroots and, thinking and sort of being active in that way. And then we've got like a kind of a different kind of movements, I guess you could call it, which is very kind of online based, that is connected to brands and sort of global corporations in that way, and often sort of appropriates Black feminism and erases history, all the other stuff that I tend to get annoyed about. But that's what I'm starting to see at the moment, is two very clear kind of forms of Black politics that are developing in tandem and in opposition. So I think that would be quite an interesting thing to talk about and see what everyone else thinks about that.
Thank you, Chardine, thank you. I liked how you sort of juxtapose the public and the sort of public facing and the sort of online world, and hopefully we can get into that later on. Then our third speaker, we have Nathan Richards. Nathan is currently completing his doctoral thesis at the University of Sussex. His research focuses on African diaspora memory practices in the contemporary digital media landscape. He is also a senior lecturer in research methods at the Academy of Contemporary Music, a filmmaker, occasional writer, and sometimes Twitter rabble-rouser who proudly counts 2 public cancellations as part of his best work yet. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Nathan.
Thank you. I really appreciate you guys for organising this event today. I think it's so important that we begin to have a conversation around the kind of popular discussions of race and how it's kind of playing out, particularly as Chardine says in this kind of online moment that we're in. So kind of building off that, I have no specific answers or strategies for you guys. I have a list of kind of concerns or things that I'm thinking about in terms of contemporary constructions of race. And I'm particularly interested in that in terms of history and kind of access points to the experience of Black people. So what I want to do is really for this 5 minutes is to kind of take you through the journey of how I got to this kind of point of being concerned about contemporary issues around race, particularly as it emerges from the US. So I'll take you a little bit on the kind of intellectual journey that I've been on to get to this place. Really what frames all of this is me really thinking about kind of contemporary anti-racist politics and what I sense as a lack of vision of what do we want an end goal to kind of be. And I feel like we've kind of lost sight of that. And I think that's leading to a certain kind of rarefication of race once again, because we've lost sight of a kind of an end goal, what we might like to see. So my introduction really to this topic begins, I think it's around 2012 at Chardine will know, and I think Fatima will probably recall as well, when I wrote a piece for the Media Diversified around political blackness. This was a kind of beginning for me. So there was a Black Writer series taking place at Goldsmiths University, and the panelist was basically South Asian women. And there was a lot of backlash to this, and almost a protest was going to emerge to kind of stop this. And one of the protesters, who is African-American, contacted me and said, because I was at Goldsmiths at the time, do I want to be part of this? You know, and I remember thinking, oh, hang on a little bit here. This kind of idea of political blackness exists here in the UK. There's been a place for it. I don't necessarily think it's as today, but these people are significant for their contributions to detailing the Black experience, to discussions around race. We can't just dismiss them as if that moment didn't take place. And so I wrote this response to them in an email that later kind of got published on Media Diversified. And of course, the backlash is my first cancellation. The backlash was, on both sides of the argument, was harsh. I think the folks who kind of advocate for political blackness thought I was dismissing them, which really wasn't what I was doing. And I think the folks who were wanting to kind of abandon this term, this idea of political blackness, probably thought I was being too soft on them. But there was a term that I used in the article, which has haunted me ever since, which is just this notion of ethnic blackness, which is an absolute nonsense term that I made up at that time. But it made sense. I guess I was trying to think about this idea of this lived experience of blackness as opposed to this kind of politicized sense. But I think Nathaniel Coleman in the room, I'm sure it is. But in conversations with Nathaniel, and if any of you have ever spoken to Nathaniel, you'll know that he uses this term of racialized blackness. And it took me a while to realize why he used that term. And it's more fitting for this idea of, as opposed to ethnic blackness, which is ridiculous, but groups of people who are kind of racialized as Black. So that was my first kind of beginning into this idea around race in the UK, in the US, and these kind of differences and kind of tensions, and people bringing their experience from other places and saying, hang on, who are these political Black people? This is ridiculous, let's remove them. That was the kind of first introduction, but I didn't pay as much attention as I probably should have. And now, of course, I was somewhat familiar with Gilroy's work around kind of the ideas of the kind of rarefication of race. And I remember speaking with him around the same time because I was writing a piece on the quota system of Brazil. So Brazil basically, I think around about 2014-15, introduced a quota system for university places. 50% of state-run universities had to be allocated to Black students. And I remember speaking to Gilroy about it, and him being somewhat reticent as criteria. And I remember him briefly explaining why. And I was focused on a slightly different tangent of the conversation. I thought these callers were great, and I kind of just, as Gilroy speaks in this really soft complexity, kind of thought, okay, maybe I'll come back to this. I didn't realize that I would really significantly, again, kind of come back to this issue later in my research. So that was the kind of second kind of nod towards this problem of kind of contemporary constructions of race. And so then I begin my PhD in memory, digital history, and participatory practices. So I start to engage more with the way in which algorithms, search terms, language play a role in curating Black history in the contemporary moment. And I begin to finally realize that the content online regarding Black history in a kind of generic sense is heavily skewed towards the African-American experience. So if you look, for example, at content regarding the Middle Passage, say on YouTube, you're primarily going to find content related to the African-American experience, and to a lesser extent to that of Caribbean, bearing in mind the majority of people, of course, who were enslaved go to Brazil, South America, and the Caribbean. And so I begin to realize that the Middle Passage is a North American conception of this moment of African people. And perhaps there are other terms, ideas, and cultural memories in Brazil that differ, that conceive of this time and of these events differently. So not only this, I realized that the technology and the media landscape supported by the kind of prowess of the US privileges the story of African Americans over other stories within the African diaspora. And this happens because of language. The language of the internet is primarily English, because of access, who has access to this kind of technology and these platforms, and because of the existing media infrastructure of the US and that cultural power that kind of comes with it. And this is when I really begin to kind of think about this topic in more depth. I think about the rarefication and dissemination of the US conception of race and how this becomes a kind of an imposition to more local constructs of race. And so this is when the kind of topic really begins to kind of intersect with my work on history. So what I realize is that local constructs of race are important. They matter because they are to places and experiences to understand the stratification that people are part of. So it's not really possible to understand the experience of African descendant people in Brazil while employing a kind of US framework of race. And my concern was, if we adopt this kind of US language and notion of race in the contemporary and project it backwards into other places, into this historical landscape, onto other experiences, what does this do to our historical understanding of those places and of those people and of those historical experiences? So for example, thinking about the policy of lightening the race in Brazil, which takes place around the kind of 19th century. This is a kind of concerted government sociological kind of policy at the time, to basically, and forgive me, to fuck the Blackness out of the country, right? To basically say, over a period of time, we are going to just engage in erasing this, this Blackness. And so this was also later picked up by sociologists who are a little bit more kind and think actually this kind of mixing is a good thing. It's an ideal for the nation to kind of have. But still, that practice is still taking place underneath it, which is basically this kind of concerted erasure of kind of Blackness. So you get these different classifications of people at different stages of this kind of transition in Brazil, different terms, different places in society, Preto, Moreno, there's just so many different terms for people at different places of the transition in Brazil. And so the American conception of race doesn't work well here. And yet our understanding of the specifics of Brazil, just as here in the UK, but to a lesser extent, becomes subsumed by this US conception of race. I'm almost finished. And so this kind of returns us to kind of Gilroy's concern around the university. How do you designate who is Black in a landscape that has nearly 2 centuries of this kind of active mixing? What is actually happening in these schools is kids from relatively privileged backgrounds who never would have claimed to have been of African descent are now claiming to be Black in order to gain these places. And if they're employing the kind of one-drop rule that kind of emerges from the US, they're not wrong, they're Black. Before this kind of, because these places are really tough to kind of get, you've got these people you look at and you never think, you know, this now they're claiming to be black. So this kind of adoption of who's black and who isn't in Brazil doesn't really work. In order to address inequality there, you need a language and a movement that is deeply embedded in the history of that place, in the historical kind of conceptions of the race system. And so the policies deal with the specifics of that country as opposed to bringing in this outside idea of who's black and who isn't. So my main concern around kind of this issue around blackness is that, or this US conception of race, is that we use it as a framework to enter different places, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Brazil, and we use it to kind of understand the history of those places, but those places are very, very unique and kind of specific constructs. And if we use the US framework, we're just gonna miss so much of the kind of history. And so there was a video that was going around about the same time. I think it was about 2020 of a guy called Godfrey. I don't know if any of you would have seen it. It's basically him saying that he went to Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, and he was saying to these people, "You're black." And they were like, "No, I'm not black, I'm Dominican, I'm this, I'm that." And he was just ridiculing them and laughing at them. And this video gets shared around and people are commenting on it on Twitter and YouTube, saying these people are ridiculous, these people are stupid, they don't know that they're black. And part of me, and that was the kind of frustration at that point, to say, well, why does your conception of race overrule their local conception of race? Why can't they be whatever they choose to be? All of the conceptions of race are ridiculous and invented. Why can't they have their invention? What makes your invention more superior to theirs? So why is all this happening now? Of course, it's about the hegemonic power of the US. I think it's going at breakneck speed now because of the internet and the kind of the gains that US African Americans are making is inspiring people, which is great. But I don't think we're doing the work to localize our strategies for this. And so we're just hearing this, this repetition of kind of US politics in places that it doesn't really necessarily work. Final point is that I actually think there's some new purity emerging around blackness, new ideas of who's really, really black. I think the idea of the one drop rule is kind of undergoing this kind of metamorphosis. And I think there's partly to do with the rise, the kind of cultural and intellectual rise of the US, and then playing with this kind of US conception of race. And so we're getting these new ideas of pure blacks, which we're beginning to kind of see play about. And so I don't know what that means. I don't know where that will go, but yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Thank you. Your point about Brazil reminded me of, I think it was the last World Cup when Neymar wrote a piece, I think, was it Neymar or Ronaldo, one of them coming out saying they're not black.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing UK Twitter and US Twitter just sort of losing it. And again, I quite like that you brought in Latin America, particularly Brazil, because I know, for example, Louisa will have a lot to say about Brazil and constructions around race. But last but not least, we've got Amandla, who will come in and sort of provide a response to the three contributors. But before he does, I just want to quickly give a brief introduction to who Amandla is. So Amandla Thomas Johnson is a British-born journalist of African Caribbean descent and is based in Dakar, Senegal, from where he covers West Africa. He has reported from a dozen countries, including on social movements in Trinidad and Tobago, Chile, and Mauritania. He has worked for the BBC, the Daily Telegraph, the Guardian, Al Jazeera, and was a trainee at Channel 4 Dispatches. He's the author of Becoming Kwame Ture, published in 2020 by South African-based Chimurenga magazine. And maybe if you pay careful attention to his video, you can see his book just behind him, the green little book on Kwame Ture. But yeah, I'll hand it over to you now, Amandla.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Fatima, and thank you everyone who's made contributions before. There's a lot to get to and to respond to. I think maybe I'll just start about sort of what brings me here and my interest. I have an interest. One of the interests I have, which has dawned quite recently, is that I'm starting a PhD on race and the Black Atlantic in the US. And as someone from the UK, I've been thinking about, I don't want to use inoculate myself, but thinking about how I can, still engage and still have a more global sort of conception of race and blackness in that space as well. my thinking about this issue sort of stems a lot from writing about Kwame Ture, and he's a very Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and he's an interesting character to talk about sort of race, and that he's born in Trinidad and Tobago. He lives in the US for a long time, and then he goes to Guinea in West Africa for 30 years. And interestingly enough as well, when he visits the UK in the 60s, that kicks off the Black Power movement in Britain as well. So there's a lot there that sort of triggered my interest to sort of talk about race. And I think one of the interesting things about, you could say that sort of generation is that they seem to believe in a sort of strong idea about Black universalism. And I think that's something that I'm going to be going back to as I just sort of recap, about what's been said. So I'll start from Robbie, and his contribution was framed by the fact that in the UK, we've been able to talk about class, but race is not something we've been able to talk about. But that seems to be shifting, and in the US, it's vice versa. So race is something that's been spoken about, but class is something that hasn't really been, part of debates. But that again is also shifting. And some of the reasons for that are sort of shifting dynamics of electoral politics. We're sort of seeing more social mobility, and also the pluralization of Black communities. And I was quite interested in the point that Robbie made about when you look at BLM, for example, you're seeing a lot of young Black feminists who are refusing to sign to the patronage of older Black men. And I'm hoping to maybe, if we could go into that a little bit more once the discussion sort of begins. Chardine, and I do follow Chardine on social media, so I've seen some of the spats you've been involved in, and you really spoke about this kind of split, in sort of activist circles, or you spoke specifically about the trade union movement, where organizers seem to be adopting a sort of class analysis, while administrators seem to be caught up in the sort of more populist, individualist, more American sort of racial politics. And I found that analysis interesting, in that you're talking about the people who are involved in struggle, involved in organizing, who need to imagine a broader base, or understanding things through class, while maybe those, I don't like the phrase, but sort of social media, I don't know, justice warriors or whatever, as your book will speak about, are sort of getting co-opted or taken very sort of essentialist or individualistic stances when it comes to race. But as you said as well, this is changing in Palestine. You cited as a place where that seems to be changing. Again, we'll come back to this. So I'm very interested to understand more, and this will be for you as well, Nathan, about how social media is sort of forging and sort of forming our understanding of race. And Chardine, I was interested that you sort of seem to say that during the pandemic, perhaps social media actually has actually led to a sort of comeback, or in a more considered understanding about race. And just Nathan now. So Nathan sort of took us on an intellectual journey, and part of that was this idea of political blackness, which one could say is peculiar to the sort of British context, and is not really something that that has happened in America, and the sort of backlash that you receive for talking about political blackness, and I guess this in some ways connects to Robbie's point about class and the need to have a sort of broader struggle as well, where you look at everything from the British Black Panthers or the Race Today collective. You had people from Marla Sen to to other Black participants as well, like Darcus Howe. You also spoke about Brazil and how applying a very a racial structure forged in America to Brazil a country that had hundreds of sort of racial categories and certainly was not, you know, very much the opposite of the sort of one drop rule, which was in America, actually leads us into a sort of cul-de-sac. And you spoke about the importance of having a local, you know, racial constructions. I guess from this, I'm again interested in this idea of universalism. Can we talk about, you know, universal blackness? Can we only talk about blackness in the, you know, in the specific, in the local, or can we talk about it in a more general sort of sense as well? And I think one of the things you also sort of said, you also mentioned the internet as well. You know, as sort of privileging a sort of American hegemonic idea about race. So maybe we could sort of start there actually. You know, about social media and about you know, sort of technology. And I think I might want to bring in Chardine here, you know, just to kick us off. And I mean, you know, do you sort of see social media as a neutral space, or do you see that some communities have more power than others? And just to take this further, you know, while we've spoken about you know, sort of you know, Black Twitter, American Black Twitter, maybe having a bit of influence. I mean, is it also possible that sort of UK Black Twitter is also having an influence elsewhere and affecting racial conversations elsewhere? I think I'll just start there. Thank you.
That's a really good question, actually. I'm trying to start doing some research on that actually for my book around the sort of power of Black Twitter as a trendsetter. You know, mainly because Nathan actually would be a good person to speak to about this because it's your area, isn't it? But in terms of, you know, how we use the medium, why we use the medium, and the frequency with which we use it, and the sort of collective diaspora community that we've created on it. And also it's an alternative media, because, you know, the sort of mainstream media isn't giving us the news and the things that we kind of want. So we go on there for our own news, you know what I mean? We always exist in a kind of parallel in some ways, where we have what's, you know, happening in the community, and then we all pop on there. You know, when that Meghan and Harry thing was happening, I was up on 4 o'clock in the morning. I was there because you know, I follow a lot of Americans and I didn't want to get spoilers, and I wanted to be there in real time. So it's almost like, even though we have these huge distances between us, you know, we're all engaging in the same way. Like, you know, these people could be across the street from me. And I think that's something that's very particular to these sort of diaspora Twitters. There's Black Twitter, there's Sikh Twitter, there's, you know, Pakistani Twitter, and, you know, people have got these little worlds that are happening. But I think for us, and I think particularly for sort of African-American Twitter as well, I mean, like Nathan said earlier, you know, we do live in a world where American cultural imperialism is a thing. And I think, you know, in some ways, the sort of Black American conversation kind of does piggyback on that wider imperialism, that cultural imperialism, in a way that Black Britishness just doesn't, you know. And so I follow people from all over the diaspora, and what's quite interesting to me is that you'll see the same kind of language and people going y'all and all that kind of stuff being used by people in South Africa or people in Trinidad, or people, you know, when they're tweeting in English in Brazil. And that is something that's, you know, it's like we're sort of kind of creating a kind of a new way of speaking. I don't necessarily want to call it a dialect, but like it's like a slang that we're all engaging in, because we're all in that space so much, and a way of speaking. And that is really highly influenced by a particular kind of African-American way of speaking. Whether that's bad or good is something to be debated. I don't necessarily think it's a negative thing, because that, you know, cultural exchange has always happened. But I think, you know, as has been said, when it comes to how we politically organise, when you see it on the ground, that's when you start to see the confusion. So one that's you know, quite a basic one that you've probably seen me moan about on the internet, is the acronyms. So we're seeing that the popularity of BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of colour, and people are starting to use that in a UK context or a French context or in a German context. But what does Indigenous mean within the United Kingdom? What does Indigenous mean within France? Doesn't mean the same thing. And to me, it's actually really rude and quite worrying that in a country where the largest ethnic minority population is an Asian population, that we're going to just dump that in people of colour and then have Indigenous there. And people, you know, it's like things like that. It's like you haven't actually really thought about, you know, what that language means here. And I had a conversation with someone about it, and they were like, well, you know, there are people of Indigenous heritage, you know, and I'm talking, you know, Native American here in the UK. And I was like, well, yes, but like, this is such a sort of, you know, minute amount of people. You can't have, you know, the largest ethnic population in a lump like that. And this erasure of what is, I mean, it is weirdly like it's an erasure of the Asian community that is happening there. And I think a lot of people don't want to sort of talk about that, but this erasure of kind of Asian activism, of you know, South Asian sort of engagement in the Black Panther movement, even starting Black History Month, the sort of group that started that was a Black and Asian group. So, you know, we're starting to see this erasure of like some pretty sort of radical sort of things that have happened. And that worries me and that concerns me, and it, you know, about how we are thinking about what Blackness means, or even just practical ways that we can move forward into sort of gaining rights on our way to revolution. But in the meantime, how do we get, you know, better working conditions, better pay, all of that kind of stuff? That requires, to be able to do that, requires us to work with our communities that experience the same thing. And if we erase those communities from that history, then we're not going to be able to do that. So it might be a small thing, an acronym, but actually what it represents is something actually quite massive that I think we need to address. But I'd be interested to hear what anyone else has to say.
Thank you, Chardine. Nathan, did you want to add anything? You know, do you think social media is, go ahead, you go. No, please, I'm all ears.
No, I think Chardine said it all, really. I am really fascinated by this idea that we are breaking borders, national borders, in this kind of new African diaspora, and that is important. So whether we can talk about a global Blackness, which I don't think I'm entirely convinced of anymore in the way I used to, but I think we can talk about a kind of an African diaspora, a group of different people in different places that share some commonalities, but there are also these local differences. I do think we're kind of forging this new global, or I should say Atlantic, kind of diasporic one. I think that's great. But of course, with that comes a negotiation, which I don't think we're seeing as much of. It's there, it's teasing underneath of a kind of push and pull between this kind of local and this kind of global kind of conceptions of Blackness. There's a battle or a struggle there that's taking place. We're not seeing it as much because, of course, partly Chardine kind of hits at that, is that the language of the internet, or the language of this conversation, is in English, right? And so there is a hierarchy within this conversation, and it is primarily African-American and UK Black folks, right? Because English dominates, and English dominates because it's the language of commerce, it's the language of American power. So we piggyback off the back of these African-Americans, but we really have very little understanding of what's going on with the millions of Black folks in France. Very few of us could actually give you any detailed insight into what's taking place there, or Brazil for that now, or Mexico for that now. We're not paying attention because partly it's in a different language. And so I think there is a negotiation to be had about this African diaspora, because the one that we're talking about right now is really the English language diaspora. And of course, these other groups are taking part in their quiet ways and are adopting some of the language in their own ways, but there are limitations to that emergent diaspora. Of course, with language comes conception, comes ideas. And so our ideas are filtering down to those. And so we're not really getting the chance to see, well, what's it like specifically there? How can you show us some new concepts around race? How have you discovered and how have you dealt with some of these issues? I think that's missing. I hope that we see that over the next decade, to be fair.
Thank you very much, Nathan. And I totally agree the issue of language. One of the interesting things was living in a country, living in Senegal for 3 years, which is a predominantly Francophone country. The kind of geography that people had was just totally different. I remember speaking to someone, and I'd known this person for 2 or 3 years, and one day they said to me, "Oh, so the UK and US are 2 different countries." I mean, in their geography, the US and UK just didn't really matter. Basically, it was sort of France, it was other Francophone countries, and then you had the sort of politics of West Africa. Coming from London, we're convinced that West Africa is basically Nigeria, Ghana, and to a lesser extent Gambia, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, which don't really get a word in. When you go to West Africa, you're seeing it's Burkina Faso, you're seeing Mali, you're seeing Mauritania. And that really sort of entrenches a certain geography that languages entrench certain geographies. I just want to move on to Robbie now, and I know that you've spoken about in the past about the sort of erasure of Brazil from conversations about the African diaspora. I wondered if you could touch on that, but also if you could touch about your experience as a Brit in America, in an American institution, and how you've had to sort of negotiate conversations around race. I don't know, do you teach sort of sort of British Black history in the US? We'd be interested to find out a little bit more about how that reception has been.
So I think I'll say something, but then I did see Barnor Hess in the conversation, and I'd love to get his thoughts on this, because he's been doing this longer than I have. So I mean, I guess what I'd do is I'd kind of latch onto what Chardine and Nathan were just saying. So yeah, I mean, I thought what I'd do is a good gauge would be to teach a course on Rastafari to my Hopkins students and see what they're saying, and of course it was entirely totally hieroglyphic to them, right? Because this is not, their go-to would be something like Black Panthers, right? You know what I mean? Whereas in the UK, the go-to would be Rastafari, right? It wouldn't even be Black Power; it'd be Rastafari, right? And so in their kind of national narrative and conception, of course, the nearest thing to Rastafari in the US would be the Move, right? Philadelphia Move, but just see how difficult that is to actually put into the US narration, right? Of freedom struggle, right? So that's something. There's something interesting about that, right? So that speaks to a number of things. It speaks to the importance of the Commonwealth in the UK thing, and that speaks to all the issues that Chardine was raising, right? And that Jasmine had put in the chat as well. And it speaks to the idea that race and racism in the UK has historically been much more consistently narrated as an issue of empire and imperialism because of the fact that because of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth was the thing that supposedly replaced empire, right? But the whole ecology of race and racism in the UK is intricately knit into the Commonwealth, and I know that not so much anymore. I know, but that also tells you, right? The fact the difficulty in situating Somali people into the UK ecology of race is precisely to do with the hegemony of the Commonwealth thing, right? So that's really important, I think. And so I'd want us to think about that. The fact that it always requires a kind of multi-sided engagement with racism and empire, for the better or for the worse, and all in between. And you know, what might be interesting, for example, is the way in which that kind of feeds its way into the US discourse, right? So, you know, from my understanding, the idea of racial capitalism, Cedric Robinson takes mainly from his time chilling out with the Institute of Race Relations in the UK, which itself is heavily impacted by the apartheid, the anti-apartheid struggle. But in actual fact, the term racial capitalism is actually developed by white South African activists and thinkers, and then is imported across to the UK, and now it's seen to be a black term. You get what I'm saying, right? But it wasn't. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just talking about the ways in which these things kind of circulate, right? But to link it, and then of course the way in which, not in all discourses, but in a lot of discourses in the US, racial capitalism is nationalized in its narrative, right? Do you get what I mean? So yeah, it's basically the 1619 narrative, which is important, but nonetheless, you would never think that there was an apartheid thing or a South African thing in there, yeah? So that said, one of the things, because I'm kind of like, I aged out a little bit. Like DVD remote controls were that's when I started aging out, because all of the buttons on them just confuse me. So I'm on Twitter, but I'm half on Twitter. You know, I don't understand it. Let me be honest, right? So anyway, but there is one thing I think that, and it pertains to what I was just talking about, is the way in which what comes to count in for the national is always about power, right? It's always about power, right? And you know, if I think about my engagements in Baltimore, the struggles are so localized, right, that East Baltimore might not know too much about West Baltimore, right? That you know, I was having trouble figuring out the city. I got a Uber one day. I've only been here for 3 years, so I'm all right with that. But you know, I've got an Uber one day early on with this African American man from Mississippi, you know, and he was saying, I just don't understand this place. I don't understand it at all. I'm going back to Mississippi, right? So that made me feel better, because I don't understand this place too. So it ain't even a national thing. So but let me just give you one little thing, right? There's a organization called the Black Yield Institute, right? And it's about urban farming and food sovereignty, all that kind of stuff. And they have and as far as I understand it, right, they have a thing called the Food Susu Organizing Co-op, right? Now the Susu term is, as I understand it, is from the Caribbean, right? Now this is very local Baltimore. All these Twitter diaspora wars mean fuck all. They just mean fuck all, right? It's irrelevant to people's day-to-day struggles, right? Absolutely irrelevant, right? And whether there is US hegemony in there or not does absolutely nothing to poor people in Baltimore. Nothing, right? Don't have a passport, don't leave the state, don't leave the city, nothing, right? Yet, Black Yield Institute has got this very diaspora term. I wonder how many people know that's not even an American term. Does it matter? But it's nonetheless shows the links, right? It came from somewhere.
Could I just come in on Robbie's point there, actually, because I think that's really interesting about the localized the localized activism in the States. And I think one's just because obviously it's just huge as well. And what I think is happening is that the UK is taking that, you know, the social media discourse that Robbie was talking about there, but because we're more centralized and much smaller than the States, I actually feel like it impacts more on the ground. Does that make any sense? So it's kind of a bit like, you know, like you could have something happening like Robbie described there, and then like I know people who are doing stuff in New York and in the West Coast. I was in Texas not that long ago. You know, there's all these kind of, because of the sort of political sort of structure of the place, with, you know, you have, you know, your sort of city wards, and that's got its own thing going on. Then you've got the state one's got something going on, some different laws going on there. And then, you know, then you've got the Senate, which is, you know, doing its own thing. Whereas the UK is very centralised, and even though we do have sort of local activisms happening, I feel like just because the size of the population, the Black population in particular within the UK, the impact of this discourse is actually maybe more toxic in a way than it would be in the US. So, you know, and I think about, like, you know, particularly with the kind of stuff around sort of poverty or who we organise with and all of that kind of stuff. It's almost, in some ways, I feel like as a Black people here that we think we are in America, with all the structures that people have over there, the HBCUs, the Black middle class, you know, all those institutions and all that kind of, you know, the infrastructure, the Black infrastructure. But we don't have that, but we're talking like we do have that. And I think in a way that actually ends up sort of harming the struggles that we're having. It's almost like we've got this sort of deep sadness that, you know, we don't have all of those things. So we like to pretend we have those things, so we don't actually deal with what's actually there.
Thank you, Chardine. I wanted to come back to you, actually. I was just quite interested to sort of hear about your thoughts about, you know, sort of Black feminism and American Black feminism sort of influence over here. And when I was thinking about Black feminism, I thought about Claudia Jones and the sort of interesting point that, you know, Jones arrived in the UK from the US in the 50s, and within a few years she had founded a carnival and founded the West Indian Gazette. And I mean, these weren't just contributions to you know, an idea of belonging and being in the UK. I mean, she was defining it, actually, even though she'd only been here for a few years. So that was just something that sort of came to mind. Someone from the US had come here and sort of done that. And you have other figures like CLR James, you know, who are sort of, you know, part of this arc across the Atlantic. Could you talk a little bit about sort of Black feminism and, you know, what your thoughts are? You've spoken about the neoliberalization of Black feminism. Is that something that has been driven by American corporate interests?
I mean, this is an international global interest, and I've had plenty of conversations with American sisters out there talking about the same thing. So, I mean, I think, you know, as a sort of Black feminist movement, I think it's, you know, I don't want to go on a sort of anti-American rant, because basically everything I've learned is from those women anyway. So, do you know what I mean? I mean, I wouldn't be doing what I was doing if it wasn't for Angela Davis and Barbara Smith and Audre Lorde and all of those kind of people. And I think, you know, thinking as a movement globally, which is what those sisters were doing, you know, and sort of trying to think beyond their borders, is something that I always try to bring into my practice as well. But I think in general, just across the diaspora, I think people have kind of lost what the root of Black feminism was. I mean, how did it start? It started in lots of different places, but I'm just going to talk about this sort of Anglo sphere, because I'm not that educated on everywhere else, which I still need to learn. But you know, if you think about the Combahee River Collective, which is the most obvious kind of point that we can refer to, and you know, those women were talking about having a, you know, socialist politics within Black feminism, and sort of connecting class, race, and gender within that framework. And I feel like the sort of work that I do is still within that vein, but you know, we have seen this sort of emergence of what I call a kind of liberal Black feminism, which might have always been there, but I would say it's kind of more of a kind of development in the sort of 80s and 90s. And so what we see is, to give an example, someone like Olive Morris, who's a Black British feminist, who was a communist. You know, she went out to China to see, you know, what sort of workers were doing out there, being sort of reframed as a gender activist, a gender and housing activist. Now, she was those things. You know, she was a squatter. Oh, no, sorry. She was a squatter, but now they're sort of calling her a housing activist, which to me is two very, very different things. One, you're breaking into buildings. The other ones, you might be down the council, you know, trying to talk to a councillor. So this sort of reframing of what these sort of really important radical Black women were doing, and sort of, you know, de-radicalizing them so they can be a Google Doodle. The same happens with Claudia Jones as well, who you talked about there. Now she's the mother of Notting Hill Carnival. They missed the bit out where she was like the most prominent, one of the most prominent women, the most prominent women in the Communist Party of the United States. And that's why she was deported. That whole sort of section sort of seemed to disappear. You know, this is the reason why she did, you know, Notting Hill Carnival. This is the reason why she did that paper. This is all coming from a politics and a way of organizing that she learned within the Communist Party in the United States. And then that sort of disappears and it just becomes, you know, what is she? Some sort of figure that, you know, brought a little sort of dance to Notting Hill. I mean, it's ridiculous. It really gets up my nose. And, you know, I think as a community as well, we need to actually own up to us also doing part of that erasure ourselves. Why are we uncomfortable? Why are we uncomfortable, particularly with radical women, radical political Black women? What is that about? Why do we feel that we need to sort of, you know, redefine them in a different way? And I think that's something that I'm trying to push back at, definitely in my writing. I wrote a recent piece recently about the sort of how sort of Marxist politics are kind of erased from, you know, people like Nina Simone and, you know, Barbara Smith and all those people that I mentioned before. And I think what's interesting to me in terms of this trajectory of Black feminism, and I think this new liberal Black feminism is so core to the way Black politics is formed today. So if you think about Black Lives Matter, you know, three women, all three queer women who grew out of the Black feminist movement. So if you're looking at a sort of timeline, this is my big theory here. So if you're looking at a timeline before BLM, so I was very involved in the Black feminist world before BLM sort of appeared. So I knew about Patrice and all those sort of women in that area. And then BLM sort of came around. And so that sort of liberal Black feminist politics started to influence how BLM kind of formed in a way, if that makes any sense. So that's how I see how that's happened. But because of that sort of liberalism, which I sometimes call, you know, white feminism in a Black face, basically. I mean, it's perpetuating a lot of the same stuff, the big boss feminism, you know, sort of, what are we calling it? The grab your bag feminism, you know what I mean? And I think that what we've seen is actually some of the politics around sort of queerness that can often sometimes be very individualized. The politics of liberal feminism, again, which just sort of focuses on sort of gender, one frame, not rethinking, you know, intersectional, I'm just going to use that term, but I have critiques around that term anyway. And then now that has gotten into mainstream Black politics. And so it's become, you know, cross-gender in a way, tied up with nationalism. So we kind of got like this sort of messy trifle of different types of political arms that are sort of in this kind of mess, and it's all defrosted and it's just spilling out everywhere. And I think, you know, some of the work that we need to do is actually kind of rebuild something that's actually a bit solid. That's a solid politic that we can actually organise around. So this mess that we've created, that everyone's confused about who is Black or whatever you know, that we just need to have some good hard food, and we know what it is, and the work that we need to do.
Thank you very much, Chardine. I think now we're going to move on to some questions. There are a lot of questions bubbling up. So I'm going to hand over to Fatima to read out some of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Amanda. I'm just gonna I just wanted to add one thing, comment in response to what Chardine just brought up about the sort of individualization of movements, of just sort of pushing that individual forward. And when I look at, for example, so my own work is on Tower Hamlets, on East London, organizing mobilization of particularly the Bangladeshi community. And when I accessed archives at Queen Mary and Tower Hamlets Library and Archives, and when I look at some of the photographs of the people who were involved, I mean, we're talking a variety of unions who turned up for the Battle of Brick Lane following the death of Al-Tabali, or even during the squatters movement led by the local Bangladeshi community. You know, people like Darcus Howe, Barbara Bees, you know, Mala Sen, Farooq Dondi, who were part of the Black British Panther Party, who came and extended the solidarity. And Mala Sen was one of the co-founders of the Bengali Housing Action Group. So I think, you know, when we look at those histories, it concerns me actually that we end up centering just that one person as if they were the face of those movements, which they weren't, when we really dig into archival material and look at who was at these meetings. When you read the minutes from their meetings, you know, it consisted of a lot of different people from different communities and areas, people who filled up coaches from different parts of London and outside of London to come and support people. So I think it's important, and I liked your point that, you know, this is what happens, right? The radical politics of the individuals is taken out, and then it's just sort of very fluffy, right? I mean, Claudia Jones was an enormously radical figure, communist, staunchly communist, and then now when you sort of hear about her, it's just like, oh, she just set up the carnival, everyone dances because she organized it, you know. So the first question we got here, or rather a comment, was about Chardine's earlier points when you did your earlier presentation at the beginning. And they wrote, thinking about Chardine's points about dated politics and the toxic breakup of activist communities, I was wondering whether any of the speakers have reflections to share on the current state of the Labour Party. So if anyone wants to take that, or Chardine, if you want to take that, and maybe stick to a minute's response, because we've got a lot of questions coming through.
I don't really think I need to go into Labour Party. But one thing that I would say is that, you know, there was too many eggs in one basket, and I think people need to organise outside the Labour Party, because once Corbyn, they got rid of him, now the Labour left, talking specifically, is in disarray. And I think it needs to learn that lesson and, you know, think about other ways to move forward.
Sure. Thank you. And the second question is related to the Labour Party, and it's Daweed who wrote, I would be especially interested whether this is true that the Labour Party, which should be inclusive and race ethnicity sensitive, has a problem with anti-Jewishness, anti-Semitism. Is this related to Corbyn's support for Hamas, or is this about the party's stereotypes of the Jews as rich capitalists?
The answer is no and no.
Okay, anyone else from the panel, if you want to add anything, or? Okay, I'll move on to the next question by Natalie. So Natalie wrote, thinking of Godfrey's joke, although he's viewing it from an American lens, blackness in the DR, I'm guessing that's in reference to Dominican Republic, is seen as proximal to Haiti and rooted in intense anti-Haitianism and colonial white supremacy. When you peel back the layers, it's not so much nationalism as it may seem. Wondering if anyone would like to expand how anti-blackness exists outside of the lens of the metropole. I think, Nathan, you made references to Dominican Republic and Haiti. Maybe if you could address this question.
Yeah, no, I don't think I actually can address the question, because I don't actually get the second half of what it is they're actually asking. I read it as well earlier. But the first part, I was generally quite aware that that in DR there is this kind of tension with Haiti, and their conception around Blackness is in part a kind of conversation with those people next door and how they're different and distinct from us. So but I think that's why it's important to kind of understand that kind of complexity that's taking place specifically there. The second part of the question, it's not necessarily kind of clear to me. Go ahead, please, Robbie. Go ahead.
No, go on, Nathan. Sorry, man.
No, I guess I am thinking about this idea of anti-Blackness at the moment, and I think it's probably one of the things that we haven't really touched on at the moment. And of course, as part of the contemporary conception of anti-Blackness, Afro-pessimism, of course, which is a kind of big engine behind it at the moment, and thinking about the way it implicates all other communities in this kind of anti-Blackness. And what that does to our kind of coalition and bonds. It's not necessarily an answer to those questions, but it's something that I wanted to kind of mention, and it kind of fits in better there. But I don't think I can answer that question. Perhaps Robbie can.
Yeah, I mean, I could say a couple of little things around that. One, just a kind of a point of fact that you know, the kind of Afro-pessimism stuff, anti-Blackness stuff, is used quite effectively by real grassroots movements, but they don't necessarily finish at the place where the academic discourse finishes. Right. So, in other words, the mobilization of it oftentimes undermines some of the premises, the academic premises of it. But it's again something that we would want to be careful to make sure that the academic the academic kind of representation of it doesn't actually elide the actual utilization of it, right? The other thing about the other thing about anti-Blackness and the globality of it, I think we still have just got such a long way to think about it, right? I spent a few years in the Pacific, and you know the big kind of comparison point there is Melanesian, right? Now, how Melos got into the Pacific was this: that the Latin, right, or the Romance tongue for black, like nigger, right, that had been taken in the Atlantic. So these dudes in the 1700s took the Greek for black, which is melos, and put that in the Pacific. So there is a analog, and analogs always invoke some kind of difference, but nonetheless some kind of real intimacy. Do you get what I'm saying? So, you know, the Melanesians are always like the Africans. You know, that's what you'll find in Cook and all them boys. You see what I'm saying? So, you know, I used to do some work with the Polynesian Panthers in New Zealand, and I put it in the chat, right? The Polynesian Panthers come out of two groups, which were kind of like cousins, local kind of, you know, not street gangs, kind of Disney style, but that, you know, that kind of very local affiliation kind of thing, right? So one of the groups was called that, and the other group was called that. Now, if you looked at some of these dudes, right, who are, you know, in quotes Polynesian, you'd be thinking, how the hell are they calling themselves that? Right, whereas some of the Melanesian ones look more, you know, what we would call black or African, right? And again, that starts to slip, right? But anyway, why they called themselves that is because, guess what? The white peeps were calling them that. Now, if they came to the US, to Baltimore, if they came to northern Brazil, right? You got them right, then people would be like, "What?" And in fact, that happened in some of the you know the Black Power conferences in the US. Some of the Australian Aboriginals come, and they were laughed out and said, "You're white." Well, not in Australia, right? And you know the economy in New Zealand, the political economy of racism is all predicated upon Maori and then Pacifica people. right? And they have very good eye for figuring out who was a Maori, right? And a Maori could look anything like all of us on the camera at the moment, and even with blonde hair, but they can figure it out. Someone going into a shop, they'll chase him or her, see if they're nicking something, right? Now, one might say, but in the global scheme of things, you know, color is a thing, and it is a thing. You know, these people I'm talking about, you know, in Papua New Guinea would get an advantage, right? These people in the US would get an advantage. That is absolutely the case. But here's the point, and it comes back to the locality thing. They're not there. And most of them are poor. They wouldn't have been able to travel anyway. You see what I'm saying? So we've got a long way to go with this anti-blackness and to figure to figure this out, right? Even go on into Google Earth. I don't know if Google Earth would do it or Google Maps, but you could go online and look for all the topological features in the world which get called the N word and then something after it, whether it's mountains, whatever, right? So you get, and that's not on the African continent. That's everywhere. So you know what we have to hold delicately in our hands, right? Is these global structures, which on a global level do all these hierarchies, right? And then the local articulations of them, right? Which is where the power lies in people's day-to-day experiences, which don't necessarily map onto that. And to hold both of those realities without subsuming one under the other. And that's difficult.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Robbie. Your response actually ties in quite neatly with the next question, which sort of where William is asking, what does universal blackness look like? And I guess the rest of the question they're trying to sort of ask, if we took our universal ideas from African descendant communities in poor African villages, would we have a different conception of what it means to be Black without losing the idea of Pan-African solidarities? Yeah, I don't know if you want to perhaps address that, or maybe Amandla, from your experiences in the Francophone world, maybe some of your insights, what if you wanted to take that question. You're still on mute, Amandla. I don't know if oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm best placed to take this question. I mean, I think one thing I would say just in general about Pan-Africanism, and what I found interesting in my research about Kwame Ture was we spoke about language. Well, you know, there was a point where in 1960s in Guinea, you had Kwame Nkrumah, you had Sekou Touré, who was the president of Guinea, and you had Amilcar Cabral, all living in Conakry at the same time, in the capital of Guinea. So you have a sort of leading freedom fighter of sort of Portuguese, anti-Portuguese sort of struggle against, you know, the sort of Anglophone struggle in Nkrumah, then, you know, against the French, Sekou Touré as well. And I've always found that a really interesting sort of touchstone to think about Pan-Africanism, really, because I think, again, it comes down to language. And when we do think about it, it is often ring-fenced by the linguistic zone, the particular linguistic zone we happen to be in. And I think, you know, we have to look beyond that, you know, notwithstanding the difficulties in trying to actually think about, you know, global blackness and some of these sort of things. So yeah, I think it goes back to language. Is basically what I'm trying to say.
Did anyone else want to say anything to that? Okay, I'll move on to the next question by Jasmine. So Jasmine question is, so just picking up on the point about the need to localize our analysis, the class politics and experience of the South Asian community in the US and the UK seem to be quite different, but they tend to be conflated. The South Asian community in the US tend to be associated with middle class white collar work and have benefited to a degree from the model minority discourse. In the UK, the South Asian community are typically working class, often the majority in the most deprived boroughs, while the Bengali community had the highest rate of COVID deaths. Does this mean the solidarities and organizing with the Black community and other diasporas would necessarily look different, and would be interested if the panelists have any thoughts on this? So I don't know who wants to take this.
think this is your work, isn't it, Fatma?
I'd rather it's about you guys. You guys are on the panel.
I mean, the only thing I'll say is I think it's a good point. I think you're right. I think these kind of differences between what it means to be South Asian in the UK and what it means here in what it means here in the UK and what it means in the US are very different, and that's why I think it's important that we understand those differences when we even, for example, in kind of relation to thinking about this notion of kind of anti-blackness, right? Thinking about those differences in what that might look like for a South Asian community in the US and what it means here in the UK. I think it's important. I will say that I think the largest largest number of South Asians in this country is actually India, if I'm not mistaken, and are actually some of the wealthiest. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they are exclusively the most working class. I think large numbers are middle class. I think Bangladeshis obviously occupy a slightly different place, and the same for Pakistanis, but I think the largest number is actually Indian, and I think they operate in a slightly different class, so let's say. But the local is so crucial, yeah, otherwise we just adopt this kind of US centric kind of politics about those communities there, and we say, oh, that's the same here, and we just plant it, and it's just really not the same. Partly for what Robbie was saying earlier about this kind of Commonwealth and empire, and this experience we've had here is very, very distinct.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of time. We've got 4 more minutes, so I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions. But I just wanted to add one point to Jasmine's question here. What's really interesting about within the South Asian dynamic is if we look at the East African Indians in particular, they're the wealthiest. And when we talk wealthy, I mean, I'm talking millionaires, billionaires. Yes. We're not just talking, so when we look at people like Rishi Sunak being the wealthiest MP in Parliament, he's an East African Asian himself. And also today's image of Preeti Patel sort of standing there and watching sort of an immigration raid happening. And Professor Gopal from Cambridge put out this tweet saying, this picture sort of exemplifies how the empire used South Asians as a petit bourgeois class in East Africa, and particularly a specific group, which were historically from India with the Gujarati community. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that. And of course, there are discrepancies. Like if we look at the Pakistani Bangladeshi communities, they're much poorer. And in fact, according to Runnymede Trust's report, Money of Color of, I think it was called Color of Money report. And in that they found that actually amongst the South Asian groups, the Bangladeshi community is the poorest. They earn 10 pence for every pound a white Brit earns, alongside African households. So it's Black African and Bangladeshi households earn 10 pence, whereas Pakistanis, if I remember correctly, 15 pence. And with Indian households, it was, I think, please don't quote me, but I think it was around 85 pence for every pound that a white family earns. So I think it's important, again, to make those distinctions. But I'm going to move on to the next question. And someone pointed out that they loved your point, Chardine, about the erasure of radical politics, which often is also an erasure of transnational trajectories. And then Parvati left a comment here saying racial superiority and inferiority is a circulating hegemonic value into which everyone buys irrespective of location. That is the point of hegemony, same in Asia. And then Liam added a comment here related to the neoliberalization and individualism of radical Black politics. Does the panel have anything to say on how the UK Conservative government appears to be capitalizing on this in terms of equalities policy? So for example, the recent Ture report's recommendation to disaggregate the term BAME and the EHRC's recent intervention supporting a woman with anti-trans views appealing against her dismissal from employment. Does anyone want to take that about the Ture report's recommendation? And the
I mean, the Ture report was, what was that report? It was a bit of a joke. And, they were stealing, putting loads of academics on there who had nothing to do with it. So, but the thing that's most interesting to me, and I've been seeing this going on for a while, this government anyway, is how they have appropriated, some of the language and discourse of this, movement, and then sort of repackaged it and sold it back to us, but kind of using it against us. And there was an incident, a moment in Parliament I think it was last year actually, and it was a debate between Priti Patel and Dawn Butler. And Dawn Butler was saying, you don't understand what racism is, etc., to Priti Patel. And instantly Priti Patel just went, well, you know, I was called the P word in the playground, etc., and I was watching it and I was like, Dawn, I don't know why are you doing that? It was almost like she forgot Priti Patel was a brown person. And I think sometimes with people kind of, they forget that not everybody who looks like us is on our side. And if you start talking in that way, of course, Priti Patel is just going to switch it up and say, well, I experienced racism too, and completely silence your conversation. If the only thing you build that conversation on is about racism, not about class, not about anything else, if it's just about that, then they will be able to turn it around. And that is what they're doing. So, you know, I reckon we'll probably will have Rishi Sunak as a first BAME Prime Minister. And he'll be saying us this multiracial Britain and he managed to do this and whatever. And then what are we going to say? What are we going to say about that? Because we've just completely stripped everything from the politics to be able to push back against that. So that's why it's really urgent for us to start getting back that class analysis in immediately, because that is what we're going to be faced with if we're not careful, and it's already happening. So yeah, I think the Conservatives, whoever Dominic Cummings, have been extremely smart in how they've manipulated this, because they've seen us take the eye off the ball. And so we've kind of created this trap for ourselves, basically. So we need to kind of get out of it.
Robbie, I can see you nodding away. Did you want to add anything? No? Anyone else? Okay. I'm really sorry to the audience. I'm seeing a lot of questions and comments coming through. I'm just going to take one last question. And it was a request by Mohammed saying, can the panel and host kindly recommend a book, resource each that they believe is important to read to understand what is being discussed or otherwise? So yeah, so if each of you could just recommend one resource or book, I'm happy if Louisa or Mehdi, if you could type it out while it's being recommended, and then we can end on that note.
Yeah, I don't remember the author's name, but The Many-Headed Hydra is a book that I would recommend. Let me see if I can find the name. Robbie, do you know the name of the author is?
Linebaugh and Rediker.
Peter Linebaugh, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. Robbie, what would be your recommendation?
So, I mean, there's a,
other than your own book.
Too many to mention, man.
Yeah, do your own book.
Help me, man, help. I mean, to be honest, I would actually say, like, it's worth, especially for the UK situation, it's worth actually rereading Stuart Hall's Police in the Crisis, not the whole book, but the last chapter. And it's a great meditation on the degree to which things are different or things are the same. Okay, it's really contemporary.
Thank you so much. Amanda, what would be your recommendation? Oh, you're on mute, by the way.
Yeah, at the moment I'm reading and quite enjoying Here to Stay, Here to Fight, which is a Race Today anthology of the Race Today collective, which included a lot of sort of activists from the 70s, 80s. I would recommend that. It gives a good grounding on kind of what led to where we are today, basically.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good recommendation, actually, because it covers almost everything: education, housing, trade unions, so many different areas. So yeah, sure. I definitely back that. And Chardine, what would be your recommendation?
I've got two here, so I just had to get my partner to grab them off the bookshelf. So this one, you see that Coolie Woman that I'm reading at the moment, which is about indentured labourers in Guyana. So that's actually part of my law degree module. But this one as well, Sojourning for Freedom, which is Black Women, American Communism and the Making of Black Left Feminism.
Okay.
Which is, I found out about on a Twitter thread. So one of the good things about social media as well. So
brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you. Wow. What a discussion. Just a massive thank you to the panel. Thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of our conference, our roundtable discussion. We tried to keep it as sort of informal as possible because we wanted it to be discussion centric and sort of just expanding on some of our own ideas, insights. And just a shout out and thank you to my friends and colleagues who I co-organized this with Mehdi and Louisa. So thank you guys. And especially Louisa, who came, who initiated this whole discussion, actually. So thank you so much. And we've got our second part of this discussion happening tomorrow, same time, 5 o'clock till 6:30. We've got another amazing panel of speakers who are going to be speaking and looking at issues around policing, race and policing of migration, and looking at sort of we want to look at sort of multiculturalism and how it's changed since the days of good old Tony Blair and the sort of state-sanctioned employed understandings of multiculturalism. So please do join us tomorrow at 5 p.m. But thank you everyone and have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much. Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.